item here, which is item, yes, we'll request time on 4 and 5. And item number 6, this is an item in which we discussed last week in reference to the Beyond the Table grants that have been allocated. Mr. Hardy is here to talk about this. Mr. Hardy?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Mr. John Garfello, Vice President from Akron Community Foundation, as well as Melinda Samsel, the city's grants manager. I know that there were some requests for additional information last week. We provided those, that information, and so we're happy to continue to take questions.
Very good, thank you. Any questions in reference to this? Mr. Kamer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know you mentioned you provided information. I might have missed it, but I was wondering if we provided the ward breakdown that was requested last week, and if so,
we do have that.
Okay.
We do have that, and we can make sure that it's in council mailboxes before tonight.
I appreciate that.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, very good.
My apologies.
Mr. Neal?
Yes, sir. I too, I'm sorry if I missed the email. I know one of my questions was the metrics that was used, since we're talking about equity and whatnot, what equitable tools that we use to determine what we were given, with the understanding of, as I mentioned, a lot of things that used to get the neighborhood partnership grant were pushed into the city council grant, where where the funds were a lot more limited. And as we had discussion last week, we know that a lot of the groups that do the work don't have the technical assistance or the staffing to apply for the grant. One comes to mind, Dream Team Boxing tried to apply for that grant. His access to the internet was his smartphone. Very difficult to fill out that complex grant if you use a smartphone. And I know what we said we made, but from, as we go through, when we look at making things, what we say, equitable, even the process itself. So I'd like to know what tools we use when we vetted those grants. And then last week, as the city is working to develop its own equity policy, I would like to know with what the Akron Community Foundation, forgive me for the slip of glass, okay, uses, or are they in the process of developing a policy, or do they have one that we could even use on our end as we continue to improve our process? Thank you.
So to answer the first question, we actually utilize the exact same vetting process that we used for NPP for the last 20-some years that we've been doing the program. There was a joint City Community Foundation group of which John and Melinda were on, and they can talk further about that. But they went through the applications like we have always gone through applications. I would say that this one was slightly different in that we did, as we discussed from the very outset, this was a higher dollar amount than NPP, so there were slightly more requirements in terms of what would be more, I would consider, a traditional grant application. But we also lowered the requirements for the City Council NPP to increase access that way. Again, we had many people call for information. It was, I know John and Melinda themselves went to many ward meetings. Any ward meeting that they went to get the word out, it was in the paper. We had lots of people call for additional information. Again, anyone who wanted a paper application, we could get them a paper application. So, and that's for all of our grants. Now we have migrated to an online platform because we don't have the staff that we once had, and it's a great way to keep everybody level. But if you need a paper application, we're more than happy to do that. And just one other comment, as we get that additional information for council, from the very beginning we talked about, and I know that was a question that came up when we authorized both the new council NPP program and Beyond the Table. Was Beyond the Table going to be evenly distributed against the wards? And we talked about that, and I said no, it was going to be given based on the application. So the best application wins, essentially, within those priority areas that, again, were generated by not 1 but 2 years of on the table programming that the community identified as things that they wanted to get behind. So I don't know, I pass it on to John and Melinda to talk a little bit more about the process and then the specific question about the Community Foundation.
Sure. On behalf of the Community Foundation, we take our role as a funder in the community very seriously. It's the charitable dollars that make up what our foundation is all about, so we really carefully scrutinize all of the grants that we give out in the community. I can tell you that we devoted the 2 full-time staff to this program to go to ward meetings, to answer numerous phone calls. I think between myself and my other staff person who I oversee, 40 phone calls came in from organizations wanting assistance on how to apply for the grant. We met with a couple of them in person and kind of walked through the process with them. So we made ourselves available to anyone who needed help in the process. I didn't hear from anyone who said technology was an issue for them, because if we would have allowed them to apply via the paper route. Again, we went to board meetings. In the future, we are willing to work with the city to put together some kind of grant workshop that we can offer to the community, more technical, more in line with what grantees look for. As to your question of what diversity, equity, and social inclusion looks like, we have made this a major priority with our community foundation. As you may have seen in the paper last Friday, we made a major announcement with some additional dollars being put into being one of our proactive priorities, this whole diversity, equity, and social inclusion issue. We have purposely not defined it because every organization defines it differently. Every individual defines it differently, and we didn't want to focus on one specific issue. We wanted to make it more broad. So that's kind of our stance on that. As for the merit of the applications, we do this for a living. We look at the strength of the application. We look at the ability for that organization to raise the matching dollars. And we felt that some of the ones that didn't get grants really didn't have a solid plan in place in order to meet that match. I don't know if you want to add anything else.
Good afternoon.
Pull it forward there.
Pull it forward. There you go.
Is that on? Just to kind of piggyback off of what John was just saying, myself and a few members from our planning department that oversaw the old neighborhood partnership program, we did meet for, I think it was about 2 or 3 hours to sit down and literally go through each of these applications to basically vet them to make sure that, you know, if given this, again, this is a larger pool of money that we're talking about, whether or not they had the capacity to manage that, to make sure that they had the proper fiscal agents in place. So in terms of just the procedure that we went through to make sure that we were allocating these funds, again, citywide, but more importantly, giving them to programs that we thought would have the biggest community impact. Again, all of those things were taken into account.
And just one additional thing, this is an OID grant, and as you recall, we do define what equity means to the Office of Integrated Development and how we're measuring that over time as a department.
Very good, thank you. Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. Further questions or comments from anyone? Samples?
Thank you. You may have touched on this prior to me arriving. Did we receive a spreadsheet from Helen? She was supposed to get us a spreadsheet for the breakdown.
You will have that in your mailbox before tonight.
Okay, so I
But
know
yes, it has
there's going
the
to be a
word.
word breakdown. However, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'd like to see though, you know, I'm looking at the little description for each one that received the award, and I'm just really wanting to know what that looks like when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because I know we pinpointed these 3 areas we want to focus on, and I'm just really struggling with, I mean, kudos to those who were able to do the application. The application was very difficult for some people. I had residents come down and I actually sat with them trying to maneuver through this application, and it was difficult. There was a lot of questions on there that someone who's not seasoned at applying for these kind of grants, I just don't see how they could have gotten through it. But when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I've said this last week, and I don't want to, you know, sound like I'm beating on the drum here again, but when I think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I just don't see how golf and farms fit in there. I don't. And maybe that's just me, and I need to maybe broaden my perspective a little bit, but that's not what I see when I see diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'd really like to know, those awardees, what's that focus where they were given the award as it relates to those 3 pillars that we're focused on?
So that will all be in the the spreadsheet you'll get. But just as a point of clarification, so social inclusion was, obviously, it's always a lens, but it was one of 3 pillars. So the other pillars were youth and drug addiction and awareness around that. So based on the applications received, the committee went through their work and made their recommendations that you have, and you'll see that. The other thing that I just want to stress, and again, we may have an honest disagreement here, but in my role, honestly, is at the end of the day of signing off on the use of what are federal funds, and we have to have matching, and we talked about that the last time with federal funds. We want, as John said, and I made a commitment last week, we will do everything in our power to try and increase capacity of anyone to apply, not only for our programs, but for any grants that might be out there to support their work. But I really do question, there's up to $20,000 of federal dollars. And while the application definitely was more traditional this time than the NPP was in the past, it was by no means the worst I've ever seen. And I think that one other question that I always ask myself is, you may not be ready for that grant. Now, we can help get you ready, but to John's point about the amount of information, and then can you steward the $20,000 with your other 20, or whatever it would be? Some weren't 20, some were 15, and some were 10, and et cetera, based on what their match was. But at the end of the day, we get audited by the feds. Every dollar has to be accounted for. I don't want to put the city, and more importantly, I don't want to put the nonprofit in a position where they get a black eye from federal funds because they weren't ready. I'm not saying that was the case in every single one, but that's why I think building capacity is so important, because we have to make sure that, obviously, to Melinda's point, we're achieving the most community impact we can. And I totally agree that oftentimes that is a non-traditional organization. So let's step in and fill that gap on the capacity building, because some of the applications were really weak, and that could be the construct of the application, but it could also mean, as we've talked about, that we need to do more to build capacity around grant writing and applying for these things, not just for our stuff, but again, for anything. Federal grants are the worst. That's why there are people that only consult on writing grants, because these things can get very onerous. We don't want to get to that point. But when we talk about $20,000, the potential for $20,000 in a federal grant, we've got to make sure, and I mean this across the board, it's not just the Beyond the Table, it's all the CD money that we use on our programs. We have to be sure that we're not setting us up for failure or the person receiving the money for failure. So there is work to do there for sure.
Right. So just one last thing. I know we brought up the issue of maybe having the tutorials and some coursework for those individuals. And Chris Miller did a fabulous job at my meeting. It was standing room only. Yeah. But there's a need, and there are people who really want to do some work here in this community. And I think us making sure that happens early on so they'll know what it is that is expected of them so they can have a stronger application, I think is very important, because, you know, when I think back to all the people who were showing up for these meetings, and I think we had 34 applications. Yeah. You know, I think a lot of them probably got intimidated by the application, because I had a meeting that had close to 70 people in one meeting, and there was 34 applications, and I think it may have been a little intimidating for them. And then trying to find that nonprofit to partner with them, and there was a question that came up in the meeting that the nonprofits would have to front their money for them, and I think some of the nonprofits were a little taken back by that, because I've never heard that before, I've never seen that before happen, and I think a lot of the nonprofits were taken aback by that. So I think giving them a clear understanding of what that looks like, especially if it's their first time applying, is going to be very important from here on out. And you know, I'm not taking away from those who won, and kudos to them. I know First Tee has been around for a long time, and I get that. But there are some people who normally applied for the MPP that didn't even apply this time, because they just thought it was just a bit much than what they were used to. So I think that once we put this in place, I think it'll help a lot of them.
No, you have our word that we're going to be out there working, and the library is also pledged to be a partner on this as well. They've got some existing programming as well.
All right, thank you.
And as we said last week, we are very happy to know that we have this partnership with the city of Akron, and we also know that this was the first year for it, and that there are corrections that need to be made.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to restate, I think it's important for us, why this is fresh on mind, and before this council's term ends, that we relook at what we did so that folks have a historical context of what we've done before and what we did this time, so that we can improve upon this going into next year. And I do want to state this. When we talk about equity, one of the concerns is, you know, you stated we use the same process we've used over the past 20 years. And I've had a lot of groups that have benefited from that process. But based on the reports that we've received about the exclusion of so many people in our community, that process has flaws. And we cannot rely on that. And when we use the term equity, here we are specifically talking about the black community. That was what was even stated in the Chamber's discussion on Thursday. And we know, all we have to do is look at the civil rights movement. When we addressed the inequities that impacted the black community, every group that was disenfranchised, their votes raised as well. So my concern, and what I really get concerned about when we talk about equity here, we quickly shift to diversity and inclusion. Let's deal with the inequity first. And so when we look at it, and this comes in so many, because right away when we start really defining equity, the young lady that comes down with the towing company, the young white lady that's been trying to get business with the city for years. If we define equity dealing with what was reported, the lack of opportunities for the black community, we automatically will become more sensitive to other groups that are excluded from participating in economic opportunities within the city. So I wanted to mention that, but let me leave with this. When we come back to look at this, there are 3 pots of money that this city that we can look at. Because federal dollars, I understand. One, we get about $125,000 to $150,000 back every year in a credit card rebate. That money should not be used to go into the general fund. Council and administration should work together to find a way to benefit how it can benefit. We can increase the pot of funding. The other is, we've talked about the search and seizure funds. There's over $1 million that the police department has. I'm not talking about the principal, but the investment of that principal should be a direct impact going back to the communities that have been impacted from the incidences that led to the search or the seizure of those assets. And then lastly, I know this administration wasn't here, but when we merged our health department with the county, the city, it was documented, it was stated, it was noted, we saved $1 million a year. And the thing was, okay, when you make a savings, where does that savings go? If we just took 10% of that, let me be a little bit more greedy. If we took 20% of that, we would be able to double what we put in this Beyond the Table. So we have to be intentional about our desire to really bring more resources into the neighborhood level. So I'm asking that before this session is over, and we know that the end of this year is going to come real quick, that this body, along with the administration, does a deep dive into this and find other ways from potential funding sources within the city, and then working with the Akron Community Foundation and finding ways how we can bring in more resources to meet these needs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Is there a recommendation on this? Ms. Amobian.
Just a comment. As you refine your process and start trying to incorporate some of the comments that you've heard, could we hear from you before you kind of take it out so we can see if there's something we can add to help as you work on your process? Just to let us know. It could be an informal meeting or just a presentation of what you plan to do.
Certainly. I mean, we have, in consultation with Council President, we certainly are going to be bringing legislation back next year to authorize the program, and we can do a full presentation on the process and make sure it's completely above board and we're all on the same page.
Sure. Okay, thanks.
Very good. Further questions or comments? Is there a recommendation?
Second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye. The ayes have it. Thank you. Anything else to come before the committee? Hearing nothing, we're adjourned. Thanks.
Thank you.